participants, and we welcome everyone to this, the first lecture of the series of 2021. Special series with a special topic, with a special emphasis, and Thomas Abel is going to be telling us about it. Why we're having this special topic, we thought about it even before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic and the situation of 2020 has done nothing but to reinforce the fact that there is not a large difference or the large gap between science, politics, and policy, but it's actually an abyss. It's like the Mariana Trench or something like that. It's a very deep abyss, and if anything I've seen this year is that it's becoming deeper and broader. So having that in mind, how do we bring public health and translate it to people, to communities, to individuals? How can we close the gap in a better way? That's the idea of this lecture series. But before that, I would like to thank you all for being here. Thank you, Thomas Zeltner, who is our first presenter, and I'd like to give the word to Thomas Abel, who has been coordinating the organization of this series. So thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Oscar, and also a hearty welcome from my side to everybody sharing and joining us this afternoon. As Oscar mentioned, I would like to show this these two slides just to introduce you to this background of the series of this year. So this the focus of the series has overall 10 presentations. The focus of the series is on knowledge translation and implementation. And we felt at ISPM that we want to strengthen the impact of our science, and at the same time we wanted to get in a conversation with practice, a closer conversation with practice, which means public health implementation, but also health policy decision making. And this is the focus of this year's lecture series. And we have, this is part of the ISPM vision for 2030. And we really hope to develop a new approach in how to engage science with practice. And often it's a focus on policy. And as you can see, these 10 speakers we have invited from around the globe. So we are very happy to have a group of distinguished speakers, and we are even more happy to have Thomas Zeltner opening the lecture series. I mean, there's not much I could ever say about his accomplishments, and you saw this from the CV and the bios that we have attached in the announcement here. Just to emphasize perhaps one thing is that Thomas is the former director of the Federal Office of Public Health here in Switzerland. And besides his many other outstanding achievements, we thought this is, for this lecture series, perhaps the most relevant. He knows, like nobody else, knows the science and the policy making and how this actually communicates or does not communicate. So this is why we are extremely happy to have you here, Thomas Zeltner. We feel honored. And before I hand over to you, just let me remind our audience that there are 3 ways to get engaged with questions and comments. That is, please use the chat option in Zoom. Please write your questions there, or you might switch on your camera when Thomas has finished his presentation and we start the discussion, or you may raise your hands in the participants button down there. There is an option where you can raise your hand. I also have to apologize in advance in case I miss a question or a comment. Please forgive me. I'm also not very familiar with this new technology, but I think together we can. So without losing any further time, let me hand over to Thomas. Thomas, thank you so much. As I said, we feel honored. We look forward to your presentation. I had already seen a glimpse of the slides. I love them, and now I cannot wait to listen. Thomas, please.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks a lot for these kind words of introduction. And as you said, what I am going to do is not so much talk as a professor of public health, but more as someone who has a long experience in being in a public health position in Switzerland, and in that respect, looking into how does the public service actually interacts with the academic sector, and how to be a good politician in that respect. Now I try to get the slides on, and I hope that will work. Yep, it does. So what the title I have is talking about independent scientific advice to policy makers before, during, and after the COVID crisis. And let me start with something which in this COVID crisis is, the important point. The advice we are looking from science is really looking into the future. We have a new virus, we have a new pandemic, and the question which is on the table is really, what will the future be, and how, as a politician, do I shape the future in order to have a minimal impact of the pandemic? And I start with this saying, which probably all of you have seen in the past. You cannot predict the future, but you can create it, which I think is a lovely way of looking at your life. Very often you don't know where you will be ending, but you're not victim of your life, but you can actually create your own life. When you're a politician, that's not what you're asked to do. You're asked to create the future. You have to create the future. I mean, and there is this French saying, gouverner c'est prévoir. If you're in a political position, people expect you to create a happy, healthy future. Now the question is, you cannot predict the future, we know that. And the question is really, and that's a scientific question behind all what I try to do, how do we predict the future? And how can we be helpful for politicians then to create the next steps, or to do the next steps? Let me start with this big picture here, which many of you may know, some will not. The Swiss, that's actually our Swiss government. They meet every week Wednesday in this chalet, as we call it. It's a room, and it's very traditional, and it's a little bit like the Capitol in Washington. We would be totally concerned if this room was invaded, because it's a kind of sacred. As even a senior official, you're hardly ever allowed to get into this room, and all what is done in this room, which is governing Switzerland, is highly confidential. So if you, as one of the fields of knowledge of or competence of the government, you want to have an input, you need to go to see this person here you see from behind. That's our Minister of Health, and he will bring in the health issues via the Federal Office of Public Health. And the Federal Office of Public Health, again, will try to get all the evidence possible into what the Minister of Health is bringing into the government in order to have a debate and a decision. So that's how our system works before the crisis and normally works. The Federal Office of Public Health has actually 6 ways how to tap on science. Point 1, and I stress on that, is actually in-house experts appointed by the office. When I was head of the federal office, I always said, I want in each area we're responsible, and that's a huge area, at least one of the top experts out of the top 5 experts in Switzerland to work in the federal office. So if we were dealing with HIV/AIDS, one of the leader of the Department of HIV in the federal office should be one of the top experts and have its network. Secondly, there is a system of National Permanent Experts Committee elected by the government for 4 years. You hear quite a bit about the Committee of Immunization these days, and this is one of these committees, and there are many, but of course they're pretty stable, 4 years, 4 years, 4 years, and by doing that we have a stability, but at the same time probably not always all the experts in Switzerland included, which gives the third way is national ad hoc committees as the task force the government set up right now for the COVID crisis, where we put together experts in different fields needed for a given question. Then there is this National Centers of Reference for controlling. I don't go into that more. And then, of course, there is a possibility just to mandate single experts. Finally, and don't let us forget that, there are these international experts organizations, particularly the World Health Organization, the European Center of Disease Control, OECD, and others. And that's the whole area, a range of scientific possibilities the Federal Office of Public Health can tap on. What the policymaker then need to do is actually mastering 3 different processes, and that's what they normally do on Wednesday morning. A, they need to have the needed knowledge at hand and understanding its relevance for the decision making. They need to master the political process to build acceptance for the implementation of this decision. Let's take the decision they have taken yesterday. Obviously, they needed to discuss, would the private sector, the business sector accept a shutdown, and how many of the federal councils are for and how many are against? Do we come to a consensus? Can we implement something which builds on enough support? And finally, you can't be in a leadership position without having enough trust and to overcome all these conflicting values and distrust and decide in such a manner. And then, based on this system, the coronavirus came. And what the government normally does when a crisis like the coronavirus comes in, then he sets up a crisis organization. So many more offices, many more people are involved. And it's not only the Federal Office of Public Health, but it is actually the total crisis organization who is now in charge. The problem with that is that this crisis organization works like a project organization. And so if you're head of the federal office, you have your own office and regular tasks, and then you have this parallel organization, which is a project you have to run. Let me go into some of the specifics of this crisis. And I think one of the most important one is to realize that this is really the first crisis in the age of social media. And what does that mean? It means this: all of us from the morning to the evening are completely overflooded with information. And the information to stay here, some may be relevant, some may be non-relevant, some may be true, some may be wrong, etc. So what we see in this crisis is that we have what I will call later infodemic. The second thing we realized in this crisis is that science speeds up enormously. And we're very happy and glad about that. I mean, the number of findings that the COVID crisis has actually produced, the number of papers, is just astonishing. And the same is true with the products. We're very happy that we have the vaccines by now. We will be working with new medication, etc. So one of the phenomenons we're seeing is actually the speeding up. The other phenomenon, and that's the point which makes it very difficult these days for the public, is that fake news and real news are so hard to distinguish, and there is really no good mechanism so far to make any kind of distinction. Another phenomenon we saw with the social media is that there are many scientists on YouTube, many channels, and scientist A says something, scientist B says something, and that's not really congruent. As a scientist, we all know that this is the normal way science is produced, but for the public, it's pretty confusing. And that has actually pretty early in the COVID crisis led to distrust and confusion of the public, a confusion within the government. What kind of scientists do we need to have on board? How do we manage the knowledge transfer, the independent science advice? And there was a certain moment at the beginning, really a total confusion about what kind of science do we need. Had an input on the trust. Whom do we trust? And we see that still today. And really, rather early in the pandemic, the UN systems, the WHO included, said, countries, please take a stronger action to stop the spread of harmful information. And the main message is, please, countries, understand that you need one voice, one face, one message to master the crisis. That was the day when our Minister of Health decided to take one of these instruments we have, namely expert committee ad hoc, and he appointed the scientific advisory board on March 31. And the point was really, and Matthias Ecker, who is obviously on the call, was appointed head of this advisory board. And we tried to limit the number of people interacting when it comes to public health questions to 3 persons: our minister, the chief scientist at that time in the office, and to the chief of the scientific task force. in order to get some peace and some stability into the communication. And I think that definitely helped. You see here a quote from OECD. No matter what the evidence base is, the public needs to understand. Sorry, I can't read all of it or need to push that down here. Policies that are selected need to be understood and adopted by citizens, which means that those providing the evidence needs to be trusted. Ultimately, it comes down to individual scientists to provide scientific advice to policymakers. And the selection of these individuals is absolutely crucial. We did a good job, I think, and the task force did a good job, because obviously with the task force in place, the trust in science in Switzerland actually increased over the months till now. And if you look at this figure here, and that's certainly something we would want to work on, the trust in science goes actually in parallel to the trust in the government. The more you trust your government, the more you trust in science. So it's the same group of people who do that. Whereas at the very end, you have people who do not trust in the government, and they don't trust the science either. Let me go to a next phenomenon. This crisis is a marathon, and I won't go too much in it only with one point. We see more and more exhaustion, burnouts. Of course, we see it in the hospitals and in the healthcare sector, but we also see it in the science field, and we see it in the administration. You have to remember or to remind yourself that in the administration, everyone has now two jobs. He is or she is in charge of the regular activities, and he or she is part of the crisis organization. And to handle the two jobs, both of them at speed 150, is very challenging. Matthias Ecker may say something how challenging and demanding it is to be on the COVID-19 task force and at the same time in the university. What we saw in the BAG, I can't say to the task force, is we lost at least 10 people in the last couple of weeks or months in burnouts. And it's really one of the questions we need to deal with. If a crisis is not only going on for 6 or 8 weeks, but is going on for a year, then the question of human resources and how to organize that is critical. What we have seen, and that's another new phenomenon, is that this crisis is getting more and more political. I mean, it started right at the beginning between the US and China. It went on that the US stepped out of the World Health Organization. So we have this political tension on the global level, but we do have it also in all kinds of different countries. The US with the elections. We hear and see now that Israel is going back into election, and the whole vaccine program luckily is taken up by Netanyahu very seriously. Also because of the election in Germany, there is a big fight about the vaccine strategy. And in Switzerland, you have seen the consensus is getting politically more difficult, and that has an impact on what kind of decisions are taken. many of you may have seen that. One of the phenomenons also is, and that's a German text, Warten ist tödlich. Von den vielen bitteren Erfahrungen, welche die Schweiz im Umgang mit dem Coronavirus bisher machen musste, ist dies die bitterste. Wer im entscheidenden Augenblick zögert, muss rechnen, dass mehr Menschen sterben und so weiter. We see, and this is the text in English, that this crisis does not allow for waiting and hesitating. And that's one of the problems the task force, the scientific task force had with the federal government in October, November, December, that they had the feeling the government, because of political reason, is hesitating. I totally share that view. And it was very difficult for all of us to see that it was clear that we need to do something, but that the government was still waiting, and that this waiting ended up in being very deadly. Let me jump to the last point, and I see that I'm getting too long. After the crisis, what will happen after the crisis? The first thing the government will most probably do is go back to the regular normal way of procedure. So the COVID task force will be thanked and will have an end. The crisis organization within the government will be deleted, and we will come back to a regular normal way of governing. What will stay nevertheless also is, nevertheless, a couple of things will remain. Let me start with the social media will remain very active, and we need to find ways. How do we do appropriate public health policies, evidence-based policies in this chaos of news and fake news? A second point which will remain after the crisis is a very vulnerable planet. It's very possible that we will go out of the crisis and come back to a more or less normal life, whereas other parts of the planet not. And we need to find solidarity to help. The last two ones is we will end up with a high burden of financial burdens, and how policy will be made in that field, we will have to see how can we actually deal with that. And finally, who knows whether the political fights will continue. I guess they will, until we have found solutions out of this crisis and taken the respective lessons. Coming back to what Thomas Abel asked me to do, what are the goals we want and can achieve? I think what should be our goals is keeping and increasing the trust in science, and in parallel in the government, because without the trust, we will not be able to overcome these hurtful, painful crises. Secondly, I think we need to get much more attentive to this infodemic, and we should, and that's not included in our pandemic preparedness plan so far, that we include the fighting of infodemics in the preparedness plans. And finally, I think, and I'm speaking here, of course, personally also, we need to strengthen global health, because we see that we're all in one single global village. how can we achieve these goals? I think the first one, the scientific community should really actively participate in the post-crisis evaluation and give their input on what they felt went well and what went wrong. Implement WHO Infodemic Action Plan in Switzerland, and finally strengthen WHO and global health. Where are the risks? I think risk one is that the political fights will go on after the crisis. Austerity plans will be on the agenda, and of course, we never know, the next crisis may be around the corner. And finally, how to avoid these risks. I think we all are asked to bring in evidence-based scientific contribution so that we really stick to what we promised to do, namely evidence-based policies should be what Switzerland is doing. Austerity plans, probably we need to be modest, and solidarity is part of what we should be doing. And the serious review, of course, of the crisis and preparedness plans need to be done. I mean, you see a lot of it already in the newspapers. There is quite a bit of things that we need to improve for the future. Thank you very much. And I finish here with my presentation and gladly answer any kind of question.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you so much. I see the clapping hands coming up. And in fact, I mean, I thought this was really a great presentation, touching on a broad range of issues, but the way you did it was really in a way that's accessible to our interdisciplinary audience here. Thank you so much. Of course, I have questions, but of course, as a host, I'm not going to start with those. I can see that others are ready. I have not seen chat contributions, so I guess people trust that if they switch on their camera and they raise their hands, that I will spot them and I will do my very best to not miss anybody. So may I ask, I see that some have switched on their camera. There's Christian, there's Matthias. Who's going to start?
I'm very happy to start. So first of all, I wanted to say this is a very interesting presentation. And of course, hearing this from the person who was in charge when we had the HIV/AIDS epidemic is particularly pertinent, because at that time, when I was a young epidemiologist, I was very proud of the Swiss public health response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I wasn't the only one. I think the Swiss response to HIV/AIDS, which you led, Thomas, was internationally acclaimed. It earned a lot of attention, the attention to human rights, the original campaigns that were run, and it was fast. Of course, the HIV/AIDS epidemic is on a different time scale, but I just wanted to say that initially, that what a contrast, Thomas. The COVID crisis and the HIV/AIDS crisis in terms of the public health response. Now, the first slide that you showed was you cannot predict predict the future, but you can create it. I think this is an odd statement in the context of in infection disease dynamics. This is exactly the situation where you can predict the future. You can determine the basic reproduction rate, you can determine the effective reproduction rate, and you exactly know what's going to happen next. And that is what politicians have incredible difficulties to understand, an exponential function. So I disagree with that. I think science must get that message across. You can predict the future. And actually what happened yesterday is the first time in the public health response that politicians actually sort of took that into account. They know that this new variant is coming, and they act at the time when the number of cases is actually slightly going down. Then you showed the room of the Bundesrat, you know, where they all sit, the 8 desks. And I'm sure you've been in this room. I have also been in this room. And it's very interesting in what context I was in this room. This was a foundation where the government plays a certain role, and the people who donate to this foundation were being given the privilege, and I was there as the president of the Swiss National Science Foundation, because it's a science foundation that I'm talking about here. The Marcel Benoit Foundation. So the people who donate money were being shown into this, you know, holy grail of that room. And I was there because I actually now that, you know, I with the SNF, we decide who gets the prize, who gets that money. That's why I was there. I was never there as head of the Swiss National Science Task Force. There wasn't a single meeting of the Federal Council with the whole of the Federal Council, all 7. That would have been extremely important, that we would have been given an hour or 2 to explain infectious disease dynamics and what happens, you know, when you do this or the other. Now, my last point is that your talk was incredibly helpful, but what you didn't address was the question of the lessons learned. I mean, what we've seen is a response that I think we can all agree. I mean, you said it yourself, that wasn't ideal, to put it mildly. What could we improve? How could we adapt, for example, the law on epidemics? What about federalism? How could we overcome this problem that we saw with the, you know, cantonal decision making? How can we make sure that what Christian Althaus in a tweet said, that science and politics meet at level and actually talk to each other, you know, accept each other and listen to each other? I don't, you know, the Science Task Force has written more than 70 papers. I don't know how many of these papers were read by, I don't know how many you read, Thomas, but, you know, how can we make sure that this dialogue, which is crucial in this situation, really takes place? It did not take place in the way it should have. That is certainly one lesson that I take away from this experience. I could go on and on, Thomas, but I won't. And I'll stop here and hand back. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I could just add 2 or 3 sentences, but I don't want to take too much of your time. Point 1, yeah, it is a little bit, you know, crazy. The only person who is allowed once a year to go into the Federal Council and give a 1-hour presentation is the head of the Nationalbank. And he is the only one who is invited. No Secretary of State is ever invited to go there. No head of an office. And I was there actually in twice. And it was twice in the meetings because of a crisis. It was the swine flu and it was the drug crisis, where they asked me to come directly. But that's extremely seldom. The second thing, of course, I share totally your view. We need to revise the law on epidemics. We need to review our crisis structure. And maybe you have seen the article today in the NZZ. I mean, the joke is that unfortunately we have actually a system of crisis management, but this time the government and the offices didn't follow this crisis system.
Well, thank you. There was a first part that Matthias addressed, and that was that the future is predictable. And for this, maybe we move on to another, just a comment. I think parts of the future are very much predictable with good prediction models. But how the whole society reacts, how the labor market will react, that's going to be a little more difficult to predict, I would guess. So, but there's then, who's the next to ask a question or bring a point up?
I'm happy to say something.
Please.
I raised my hands. Thanks, Thomas Zeltner, for this nice talk and overview, and thanks, Matthias, for sharing these thoughts and the issue about the lack of contact, with which I completely agree that it's really amazing that the whole Federal Council never really took the opportunity to get informed about this pandemic from scientists, and that's certainly something that should be looked at later on as well. But I have several questions, but I try to raise two of those. So one thing is, Thomas Zeltner, you mentioned these different groups and commissions, and they're the federal expert commissions, and of course there is also a federal expert commission on pandemic response. And I was a bit puzzled that this group of experts, which are responsible for pandemic planning, but also pandemic response, at least that's what it says on the website, have never been activated. So my question would be whether you have any idea that that didn't happen, whether you think this group should look differently, or people should be replaced, or whether the whole group should be replaced with a, basically the different sort of expert group. And the second question would be to you, because I've thought a lot about the pandemic response of Switzerland, of course, and in what sense individual peoples who at different levels who were in charge of different things were responsible for things that were done or maybe not done, or done in a certain way. So I was wondering, or would like to hear from you, if that's possible, if you were still in charge at the Federal Office of Public Health, what do you think would you have done around February, when the signals were starting to be very clear from the World Health Organization, when scientists started to get nervous, when there was this public discourse. So I really wonder about your ideas in terms of how would you have prepared for this pandemic, and in what way you would have thought the contact to the local academic community. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And nevertheless, allow me quickly to come back to the point, Thomas Abel, and because it gives a part of the answer. I think what we would need to do in the future is to divide from a scientific point a little bit more what parts of this epidemic can be predicted, can be calculated with the modeling you're doing, Christian Althaus, which is fabulous, and what part are intervention in a complex system where you never know what part of the population will do what exactly. And it was, in my view, one of the confusions that we didn't take that apart. And because, you never know how many people will actually follow wearing a mask. Should we punish them? How do we deal with that, etc.? So I think one of the lessons is probably we need to be more careful. This is linear, this can be predicted, and this is complex and that cannot be predicted, and let's try and let's correct. Now, your questions, Christian, are pretty easy. The pandemic expert group is a big surprise for me too. Nobody really knows why they have never been activated. This is a group, when I was in charge, we didn't have that. And I looked through the list of the members in this group. Quite a bit of them are actually in other groups by now. A number of them are in the ECIF, in the Eidgenössische Impfkommission. Another number is in the task force. And so maybe their knowledge has just been used in other pockets. But you're very right. This expert group is more like a joke. It has never done anything. The last thing, what would I have done differently in February? And it's a little difficult to say, but I have the feeling from the contacts I do have with the federal office that they never were really close enough to the World Health Organization. And they didn't follow up so close was this organization as an expert organization is advising, is doing. Of course, one can discuss about should they have blocked the travel from China earlier, etc. But I think one should have had a more intensive interaction with WHO very early. And the second thing is, I agree totally. I mean, the task force was established in March. I probably would have put together this task force in January, February.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to the next question from the floor, so to speak, let me read a question from the chat, Thomas, that goes to you. So again, thanks for a great presentation and lots of applause. And then it says, trusting quality science is fundamental to every society. However, there are concerns on the political and economic agendas driving science today. So the conflict between the various interests, of course, and thus this is lowering public trust. What should we do to improve these aspects in the future? So how can we strengthen the trust, which from my perspective, I think is still pretty good in the Swiss society, but it may be in jeopardy if certain things continue to go wrong. What can we do to improve trust?
If I knew exactly, I probably would get the Nobel Prize. No, the point is, and that's why I actually insisted on that quite a bit, is WHO now says you need to fight two wars, to use that word. You need to fight the epidemic, the pandemic, and you need to fight the information and misinformation. And these are two key strategies you need to be strong in. And I think as public health persons, we need to take this infodemic and the social media very seriously. I mean, if you, and I really jump, if you look what happened in the US, you see how damaging it can be. And we, as a scientific community, need to learn how do we live as a scientific community in that world of social media. And WHO, the UN, is giving quite a number of suggestions how to do that better. Oh. And go back and look into how to fight infodemics.
Okay. Thank you. Another question from the floor, perhaps before we then go back to the chats. Is there somebody else who has the camera on who wants to ask or bring forward? I see Oscar. Oscar, please.
Thomas Zeltner, thank you very much for the presentation. Excellent presentation. I think we are handling an imminent crisis that is with an underlying far more serious and long-lasting crisis that is going to be planetary health. In fact, your last slide was the planet in somebody's hands, but you didn't say anything about it. You just say, thank you very much. But I would just like to ask you, why did you close with that slide, and to elaborate? You gave us a hint on that aspect, and I think that is the real challenge that we're going to have.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to say in a few words what are my major concerns, then I would definitely say it's the climate change and it's pandemics, which are both related issues. And it is clear to me that our well-being, our happiness is so much related that we understand that we are one community on this planet. And going beyond that, we're not only human beings, but there are animals, etc. But I don't want to become philosophical. But that, having said that, we as a Swiss population, and I'm totally convinced about that, we will not anymore be happy, prosperous, safe if we don't reach out to the rest of the planet and to be a decent, fair citizen of this planet. And that's the reason why I brought that in. We need to, strengthen our capacities to reach out and to contribute to human prosperity, but also to peace.
Thank you.
Well, I would love this as the final statement, but we have to go on. There are too many more questions. So any other questions from the floor? If not, then I'm going to read another question from the chat. Why is it that in the case of HIV, there was rapidly money made available for research in Switzerland? This time, nobody seems to bother. NRP 78 had 18 million. Is that Matthias' questions? Or
no, but I would be happy to respond to it.
Please go ahead.
I actually can't see that question in the chat. Anyway, I think the opposite is the case. I think Switzerland in that respect, and the Swiss National Science Foundation was one of the first national funders reacting to this crisis. So already mid-March, we had a call out for proposals with money that we just liberated within the organization, and that was 10 million. And then the NFP 78 is another 20 million. It will be expanded with a social science and humanities component with about 5 to 10 million, we'll see. And of course, there is a registry with research funded in Switzerland on COVID, which we also set up at the SNF, which shows a large number of funded research projects. So I would sort of reject that. I don't know about the funding. I mean, the Swiss National Science Foundation, of course, also funded or now funds the HIV cohort, the Swiss National HIV cohort. And interestingly, at the time when Thomas was in charge, this cohort was actually set up by the Federal Office of Public Health. So at that time, the Federal Office of Public Health was much closer to academia. Imagine they set up cohort studies and they sent people to the United States, and one of them is on this call, Marcel Zwalen. He went to the United States to do a PhD in epidemiology at Johns Hopkins while he was employed by the Swiss Federal of Public Health. So there was a completely different, I think, spirit at that time. Thomas, you correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my very strong impression. And research at that time had a different, I would say, importance at the federal office than it has today. Today, in my personal experience, when I do research for the federal office, I already know what answer they want. And it's not open, open-ended. It's basically they need someone to say this. And that's something I don't like to do. And that's why I've sort of stopped applying for these. Thomas, you may want to comment. Perhaps I'm a bit
No, definitely. And it is really a shift in culture and in understanding.
Yeah.
And that's a reason why I said, and in trust, by the way, and in trust from the parliament towards the federal offices. In my time, and I think this was fair, we said we're a highly professional expert organization with in-house experts. So as you said, we set up actually the in-house HIV cohort. And I would mention another area. Nobody, I guess, in Switzerland, and we saw that in other countries, would have had the political power and the scientific expertise to start with heroin prescription in drug users. And we in Switzerland, from the federal office, started saying, let's try that. And let's try that very seriously. But we could only do that because our scientific credibility was very high. And the government and the parliament said, okay, we give you what is, a special funding for the government agencies. And at my time, we actually had a research budget of 25 million, which is quite a bit. And we were investing in people, as you said, to make them good researchers and public health experts. And I really think we need to think, should we not go back to that strategy, having a closer link, and I would even say exchange between the scientific community and the federal offices, job rotations or anything like that, in order to have really highly professional offices. Stop here.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Matthias, for this clarification. You saved the honor of the Swiss system of funding research. It's not all that bad. There's actually quite some very, very good mechanisms. I see that Nicola Lowe is raising her hand.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a quick question because it comes back to this point that you made about WHO, which I think for the COVID epidemic has done absolutely outstanding international work. But my impression of Switzerland and other high-income countries is that they think that WHO is for poor countries. So saying that we should have paid more attention to WHO is absolutely right, because they've had excellent spot-on advice all the way along. But it's not just COVID, it's every single health issue that Switzerland never pays any attention to WHO at all because it thinks it can do things better. So I just wondered what you thought. Don't you think you're being a bit over-optimistic, thinking that Switzerland's suddenly going to pay attention to WHO, even though it's on its doorstep?
Totally agree. But, WHO in the 80s was more or less a development agency. It was mostly addressing issues of the global south. And it has, in my view, totally changed. And one of the changes came because of the issue of health security and the pandemics, that the high-income countries immediately realized that, a pandemic starting in China may have an impact on all of us, that an epidemic of Ebola in Africa has the same. So at least in the wording of many statements at the Assembly, World Health Assembly, there is clear that WHO by now is a global health agenda agency, sorry, and not a development agency. But obviously that has not been internalized by people outside of the health sector. We see that foreign ministries think this is a technical agency which is more or less dealing with problems of the South and of poverty. We even see that in Switzerland, DEZA, our agency for development, when they invest in WHO or are interested in WHO, it's only question of the South. And we have to change that because we're not in the 80s anymore.
Thank you very much. We are slowly coming towards the end. Are there any other inputs from the floor? I don't see any. So in terms, then maybe I close this with an idea that links direct. Or Oscar wants to ask another question.
I thought Marcel raised his hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But,
oh yeah, I have too many of these photos of Marcel. Please, of course, Marcel, where are you?
I'm here. I just wrote it into the chat. Sorry, that's why I was busy typing. I would quickly like to come back to this sort of crisis organization Thomas Zeltner mentioned. And the speed it then needs to come up with solving problems as good as it's possible. You know, since summer, I had the impression that a lot of things now went back to, we now play according to the regular books and procedures, you know, being economic help that need to go through cantons. The cantons need to first have a law in the parliament before they can do anything. And I had other instances where I think the situation of the staff, even at Federal Office of Public Health and elsewhere, where basically you can't hire emergency staff because you need to first get an approval somewhere. I had the impression that a lot of these things were so rigid, and the Swiss system is so afraid to perhaps not working according the rules, how you set up to spend money and all these things. I was really disturbed. Certain things needed speed, and somehow we had that in the exceptional situation, and then we lost the ability to have speed was one of the things, and then we lost somehow the decision makers to make hard decisions. But the speed issue troubled me since summer.
Well, let me just add something here. I mean, as a public health servant, and we have been talking about that now quite a bit, you need a lot of knowledge and scientific knowledge. And if you don't have it, then you need to have the links to get it, however you do it. But you need another thing as politician. You need courage. You need to take decisions, even if it is tough. And what I see really, and I'm sorry to say that, and I don't hope that spreads too much, I see a lack of courage. I mean, in my view, the situation was long now such that we should have said, let's go back to eine außerordentliche Lage. I mean, since December, we're back in an außerordentliche Lage, and the federal government should have said, we're back in an außerordentliche Lage. Now, the new virus is here. Now they almost say we're back in an außerordentliche Lage, but they don't say it. So, and they're saying it here. We had huge debates about how much money can we spend on contracts with vaccines. And I always said, I prefer going to jail than not subscribing these contracts. And we actually overdid the budget. And I said, I don't care. Certainly we will get the money from the parliament. And as you have seen from the media response, everybody says, why didn't they spend more? And I think at some stage you just need to say, and that's I would be an invitation to all of you, just take the guts and do things sometimes, even if it sounds out of the laws, but it is in the public health perspective.
I think that's a great statement, and if this oversupply of vaccines, I wonder if we can already now start thinking about how can we link this to the idea of global fairness. And so if there's oversupply in Switzerland and like it is in Canada right now, we should now think about how to get these vaccines to low-income countries. Why not being creative on this side of promoting fairness and global equity? I think there are plenty of chances there are. I would like to thank all of you. We had more than 70 from as far as Hong Kong, I saw. So I think, and it was worth it. At least I felt this was a very open, inspiring, very informative presentation. I cannot thank Thomas Zeltner enough for this wonderful presentation. I hope we will have more of these. And exactly in 4 weeks from now, please join us again. There's another inspiring talk from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. And yeah, let's work to stay healthy, not just us, but all others as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.